friends? This is Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and we're going to talk Battletech today, a little bit anyway. And one of the time-honored debates, as I can remember, as long as I've got a map here I'm trying to fold, so that's the rustling sound I'm making, damn it. As far back as I can remember, in 1985 is when I got introduced to Battletech on the wargaming side of things, and one of the earliest debates that came out at that time was tanks versus mechs. How are mechs any better or more superior to tanks? And this has been a decades-long conversation, because there are some that you absolutely will not convince that a bipedal walking 3-story hall, whatever the heck you want to call it, is somehow superior to and will someday replace the traditional tracked and wheeled thing we know as combat vehicles today. And in our time, in our real world, who knows? That's probably possible. We might see some variations. It's more likely, and I believe in our immediate future in the next few hundred years, is we're more likely to see robotic wheeled and tracked vehicles, in part because that's what we're prone to develop, because that's how our development line is. We're looking at an alternate universe, an alternate reality for these machines in the first place. So that aside, my argument or my pro for Battlemechs' existence has always been the adaptability of the extreme terrains that combat vehicles as we know them are highly limited to or by. You cannot take a wheeled vehicle or a tracked vehicle into an environment such as this, into this heavily wooded, ravined area, and have any real successful use of them, because they're going to be handicapped. They're going to be tied to any road network that's available, and for the most part, they're going to be. We've seen this in real world scenarios. There are many encounters in World War II, for example, where tanks got involved in wooded area combat, and it becomes brutal. It's hard to maneuver, and trees drop and block the roads, and just making progress from trying to transit from one area to the other becomes almost, if not impossible. Where if you have a bipedal or a quadruped vehicle that has the ability to step over obstacles, or in many cases literally step on them and maneuver through, then you have a much more tactically advantaged options. You're going to be able to still move a lot of firepower and a lot of capabilities and options through a restrained environment. And this goes not just to woods, but look at the water and the swamps and areas where vehicles cannot traverse. We have some vehicles today that can cross a stream or a river to a certain limit, but they have limits, and they're not really designed. They need another set of equipment to get them across. They need bridging equipment or a bridge, or they need a waterborne vessel that will carry them or ferry them across that large river. Time and time again in the Battletech lore, we hear of mechs submerging themselves completely underwater and moving along or across rivers. So the Amazon River or the Mississippi River would be absolutely no barrier to mechs whatsoever, because what they can't wade to, they would just literally submerge themselves and walk through. Now, this is not to be confused. They're not swimming, and they are subject to issues with things like the terrain and the unsteadiness of terrain and currents and things like this. So it's possible for a really strong current to become a problem for these machines. But they can also traverse the bottom of a lake or an ocean, for that matter. These things, majority of Battlemechs are designed to be sealed and used in the vacuum of space, so they can pretty much be used at some pretty severe depths. I'm sure there's a limit to how deep these things could go into an ocean, perhaps. There are suggestions that there are other certain machines are more suitable than others for such environments, and they're extremely dangerous, period. But the fact, any kind of breach would be a problem. And then there's components on the machines that are subject to water damage and vacuum and stuff like this. But you now, in the same venue, we'll take the pros and the cons. In the modern BattleTech universe, in this variant of our universe, this alternate timeline, uh, the highest technology tanks and combat vehicles also are pressurized and sealed, and many of them use fusion engines, fusion reactors for power, so they could potentially do similar things. They could potentially submerge themselves and cross under a water barrier, assuming that the water barrier is uh, um, got a suitable surface for them to traverse. See, mud's going to bog them down. Uneven terrain is going to be severely uneven terrain is going to be a problem. Trying to cross, you're never going to get a tank or a hovercraft or a wheeled vehicle through something like this ever. You're just not, unless it's so radically extreme, right? It's just not going to happen. So the fact that there's so many different varieties. This is the thing. One of the I took away from early on is this idea that when man goes out into the stars and we find worlds of all kinds of variety, and it's typical for us as creators and gamers and would-be authors to envision these alien worlds in ways that we can relate to here. So finding an entire world like Hoth and Star Wars being extreme, in an Antarctic environment, is the kind of go-to. A place like Tatooine, where it's a desert world, where all the desert extremes is pretty much the entire planet. Practicalities of really alien environments also crop up here and there to give you some visuals on how these might look and how to have to cope and deal with them. Having equipment that can be operated within such ranges. See, one of the things that they don't deal with in BattleTech that much is the variety or the extreme range of extreme heat and cold, worlds where the gravities are extremely heavy or extremely light compared to, and we don't see a lot of stories or lore dealing with those. And in part, I think it's because the human nature is to deal with worlds that are suitable for them, and we are going to avoid a lot of the worlds that are not. If you have enough marginally suitable worlds, this is where we're going to be migrating. We're going to gravitate towards. That's not to say that they don't have some worlds. There are many in BattleTech that are on the extreme side, where the people live in domes, and the atmosphere is toxic or dangerous to human beings. The heat and the cold, etc. The airless conditions they're there, but they're not the norm. That's not where most normal situations. You're not going to find large scale populations on such worlds because the cost is prohibitive. I think Berhai. No, I'm trying to think of the one where, and I don't know it. The one where the Gray Death Car Legion gets blackmail, or they get framed for supposedly destroying some domes with 12 million people living in a planet where they have a methane atmosphere. And I'm just drawing a blank at the top of my head what the name of the uh, planet itself was. I'm looking at the back of the books here, and I don't see anything right off the top that, without digging into it, the name of the planet. But that place was extremely wealthy in easy access mineral resources. So it was a mining planet, but the fact that it had 12 million people living in several dome cities is pushing the envelope. And mostly that would have been existent probably because of Starlink technology from 300 or 400 years prior, and they were leftovers. But my point again, though, is that we're dealing with the ability to traverse and get through some pretty rough and tumble locations, and the ability to traverse. So when we look at the traditional tank versus mech kind of argument, my belief is that in the height of the era, when technology was supreme and it was not a problem, then this made absolute sense. And we've seen a reversion to this in by the late third secession war. Uh, the output of mech production was extremely limited. There were scores of factories still in the inner spheres to the hundreds that could produce these things, and their production lines were not producing 100 a day. They were producing maybe one a day, or one a week in some aspects, because a lot of the technology needed to produce the components that go into Battlemechs, that the know-how was lost. They didn't know how to improve on it. The clans, on the other hand, that was what made such a huge, one of the huge impacts against the Inner Sphere, was just how much advanced their equipment was. Is because the clan's whole existence was the day that we were going back to the Inner Sphere. So they too had their version of the succession wars. Don't get me wrong. All you got to do is look at Operation Klondike for that, for in-depth information on that, to understand that they too almost pummeled themselves into a dark age. Now I want to do a video on that, on the effects of the first succession war, and on technology as well. So I'm trying to avoid getting into a tangent here on this video. That's one thing I love about Battletech. There is such a huge world of issues. It's like on my previous video, one of my previous videos, I was talking about the size limitations when they construct Battlemechs. Battlemechs, since then, since my era, all right, this era that I know and love so much, the third and fourth succession war, the clan invasion. Apparently, they have come up with super mechs, which are in the multi-100-ton range. They're tripods. It's some way, a weird way to bridge the genre, the game world, to other game worlds, and I think it's something that, personally, I think it's a shame that they did that, and I don't think it's going to have as much impact as they want. This is not this is not Warhammer 40K. This is not Star Wars. You want a titanic, megalithic war machine that plods along. That's 400 feet high, etc., etc. Go play a different game, because I don't think they really fit the vibe. Now, it's just the opposite side of the equation was the Protomechs. Protomechs made more sense, as the higher technology base allowed for a reduction in size and micro technology to make smaller mechs, or heavier battle suits. Because in all this, it's kind of the middle ground. The battle suit, eventually, in my mind, could actually if technology is allowed to advance, and society is allowed to advance far enough without another round of dark ages again, where we see technology get evaporated, that the Battlemech could see it just like the tank and find itself regulated support roles, where battle suits take over, because they're even more tactically capable. They can do things that mechs can't. They can do things that tanks can't. And at the point where they can bring in enough sufficient firepower to rival these larger machines, then they already are quite devastating. The clan battle armor was just horribly devastating to the Inner Sphere forces, until the Inner Sphere could start countering them. And even as of the current rendition that I'm aware of, the battle suits are still not quite to that point. So proto suits were this kind of a step between the two, and that would be a whole other video under itself, and I think I will not go into great depth on that, because you can go to Sarna.net, the wiki version of Battletech, and find out a lot of information on that sort of thing. It's a great place to find stuff. I love it. I'm just now starting to really get to where I'm perusing things on it. This didn't exist 40 years ago. It didn't exist 20 years ago. I'm just saying. So it just reinforces me just how much Battletech's fan base is still around, and how many people still out there embrace this thing. It's great. So when looking at, the fact is, our limitations for Battlemechs and tanks and things, when it comes to size factors, is a similar issue. There's some other channels out there, Big Techs, I think, and the Black Pants Legion is great, because I've been watching some of their videos and some of their associates and their podcasts. When I have certain jobs that take me 2 hours to get there. It gives me an opportunity to get one of these 2 hour long podcasts playing and listening instead of the crap on the radio. I mean, wrong. I like my music, but it's all repetitive. Anyway, we talk about size limits. At some point, some place in the past, they decided, hey, we can only make a drop ship this effing big to get it in and out of the atmosphere, and it can only carry this amount of tonnage. If we need 100,000, we need a 10,000 ton drop ship to lift a 500 tons of mechs off the planet. If we only can move two of them because they're too effing big, it's not practical. And then there's a door situation. Our doors. It's look at our world today. There's a reason we don't have, at the height of the rail era, when rail was king, they kept building bigger and bigger trains. The problem was the gauge and the distance. This is the amount of distance between the rails that is considered standard for most countries, and it varies from east to west a little bit. But the point is that we decided not to keep building bigger and bigger trains because it becomes problematic. Tanks is the same problem. The Germans, the Americans, the Russians, especially Russians, Germans, have experimented with mega tanks to very, very limited success, in part because you get in a tank over 100 tons, the sheer amount of power it takes to move it makes it extremely inefficient when it comes to fuel, and then the road beds that it needs to traverse across are not designed to support that kind of weight, so they crush them. The bridges will not support the weight. They just there's too few bridges to move 100-ton tanks around. And then there's the transportation, the transporter capabilities. Big Texas stuff talks about this too. Texas talks about you got to have a reasonable expectation that everything's going to be able to fit on the thing they need to use to haul the thing around. So unless you're going to have mega haulers to haul mega machines, then we're back to the roads are just not big enough. And then we go back to some of this terrain issue. When I look at the worlds, I mean, we're looking at places where the roads are not super highways, and it's not practical. And the same issue, even at the end of the day, when we look at the current crop of accepted designs in mech, there's some that people cry and stick their noses up. The poor urban mech gets so much bad press, it's not funny. And I will grant you that the urban mech is a terrain specific machine. Its sole purpose was to provide a fairly robust piece of equipment for an urban environment to deal with foes in an urban environment. It doesn't need to be fast. It doesn't need to be extremely big. It doesn't need to be extremely heavily armed. It doesn't need to have a large ammo capacity. Some of those things are actually better off for it. The smaller ammo capacity means that when it does take serious damage, and it has a blowout, the ammo is less likely to destroy the machine completely. In fact, it's slow. It's maneuvering through city streets and through industrial parks and places where speed can be a problem. And if anything, you put some jump jets on the damn thing and you eliminate that issue, because that changes his maneuverability, makes it a little more maneuverable. Supply, well, it's a defending mech. It's not meant. It's supposed to be defending locations, which means it should have a ready, easy access to supply, and it's cheap. That means metropolitan police forces and sheriff's departments and fire departments and can afford these things. Where you get one Atlas that costs you 20 million C-bills versus 15 urban mechs. Hello? You put those 15 urban mechs up against that one Atlas, the Atlas is hosed. The Atlas can't barely outrun an urban mech. But you put 10 of these, you put 300 tons of these 30-ton mechs up against one Atlas. That Atlas is screwed at the end of the day. You're going to lose probably half of your urban mechs, but you know what? They're designed to be lost. They're designed to be easily repaired and replaced. That makes them extremely valuable in their environment. So the same problem comes with size. Too big a machine makes it impractical to move it around, and it's too damn slow. It can't outrun anything, so it's fixed. It might as well just be a fixed emplacement. Or, and at best, this is where we see the super tanks like the demolishers, the 100-ton tanks. Their whole purpose really is to bust into to be a fortress buster or to defend a fortress. So they don't need to move very fast because they're not going to go very far. They're only going to maneuver. The ability to move is just to allow them to reposition themselves and to react to somewhat to the situation going around them. Whereas their need for resupply and stuff, they're at their base's ability to resupply them, unless it's compromised, is pretty right on the spot, as opposed to something that's going to operate from its drop ships, which came from another planet where their base might be 100 light years away, and whatever supplies they brought with them is what they have available until the next supply run. And then meanwhile, their logistics chain is tied to where their drop ships landed, which might be hundreds of miles away from where the operations are going on. You see the logistics chain. Any good general worth his salt will tell you the war is logistics wins your war. The battles can be won by men and techniques and heroism, but at the end of the way, the damn war gets won by who's got the better supply chain and who can get that stuff to the front when they need it the most. And that goes the same with tanks and mechs, period. And this is also one of those, goes to a different debate for a completely different video when you talk about what's better, energy-based versus munitions, because obviously munitions consumes munitions, which means they need to be replenished much faster than energy-based weapons do. Just is what it is. So when we look at these scenarios, which is better, which isn't, I honestly believe that there's a reason why the foot infantry is still viable even in the future in every epic, in every genre, in every fantasy and science fiction series and novels and movies that you see. It's because there's certain things that boots on the ground other things can't do. We see in Star Wars that you can replace the boots on the ground with bots on the ground. You can have robots on the ground, droids, but you can't. But they still have limits. And if you give them too much autonomy, too much power, then you run into the AI issue as to where they may turn on you. They're not trustworthy. Well, men are not trustworthy either, more or less, because they're likely to turn on you too. But you're not. The fact is that they can adapt to their environment much faster and much quicker. Means they're still viable. We give them technology to give them the chance to survive on the field. This is why the clan's armored infantry was so much more superior than anything Intersphere had, because obvious reasons. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The Battlemechs will give you that same advantage that you can't have with your average tank. But we're back to the pros and cons. The pros of the tanks is the sheer numbers. Technology used to produce the standard tanks, the lower tech, the industrial combustion internal combustion engine driven tanks and munitions can be built by anybody, any faction with enough resources to build a factory. If you got a factory that produces tractors, you got a factory that can produce freaking armored vehicles. It's just a matter of tooling it over, right? And they can use much less sophisticated technology than these higher tech devices use and are dependent on, and get away with it and be still viable and cheap. And cheap means numbers. If you have that, with or off. So my argument still is on the favor of the Battlemech or the Battlemech universe. In our own universe, I do not look forward to the time when we find ourselves with true. The day we have an 80-ton fully robotic tank to replace the Abrams, we are setting ourselves up for a world of problems. It's a great concept, a great idea, but there's so many technological problems that come to mind and other We're not even talking ethical issues. I'm just talking physical issues. This being a bad idea, in my opinion. But hey, that's my opinion. So, this is Rick, and this is your seat at the table. So, until next time, have yourself a great